Welcome to the Scrum.org Community Podcast, a podcast from the home of Scrum. In this podcast, we feature professional Scrum trainers and other Scrum practitioners sharing their stories and experiences to help learn from the experience of others. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Hello and welcome to the Scrum.org Community Podcast. I'm your host, Dave West, CEO here at Scrum.org. Today's podcast is actually the second part of a podcast about Scrum in Japan. I was talking to Gregory Fontaine, a PST based in Tokyo, and the conversation was so interesting, we decided to make a part two. So this is the part two. Now, if you haven't listened to the first one, that's okay. It doesn't expect, we're not going to be testing you on anything in the first one. But if you do have time, then just have a look at it. Because I think, or have a listen to it, because I think you'll find it quite useful. So on the previous podcast, we talked about agility in Japan and Gregory's journey to be a PST in that country. Today, we're going to focus a little bit more on culture, particularly on how culture influences how agile is practiced in your country. Now, hopefully this is just broadly relevant, not just to Japan, but also to other countries as well. You know, as I'm very lucky in my position that I get to wander the world talking to different organizations doing agile. And it's really interesting seeing the influence of local cultures and actually country cultures on how agile is practiced. Anyway, so without further ado, welcome to the second part of the podcast, Gregory.
Thank you for having me, Dave.
Oh, wow, it's great. I'm learning a lot as we talk. So let's start really at a topic that we started to talk about in the previous podcast, which was around how do we move from a culture of analysis, or certainly, you know, the perfection game, that kind of, you know, sort of thought process into a culture of delivery. We know that's crucial for agile, and this is quite relevant in Japan.
Yeah, I think for the most part, what I'm going to talk about is going to resonate with people outside Japan as well. But from what I've seen, what stands out as keys to making that transition and that change is the mindset, adopting a product mindset. I think when people try and adopt new ways of working and Scrum in particular, or more generally speaking, agile development, if especially at the sponsorship level, if there is no understanding that the kind of problem that they are dealing with is one that requires empiricism, that requires trial and error, then everything is going to be very difficult from there. Yeah. If you believe, do you believe that you can know exactly what your customer need? Do you believe that you can tell exactly what solution will satisfy them? Do you think you can fully design upfront a plan for implementing that solution? If you say yes to those questions, then why bother? And one big obstacle is that many people here are going to say, yeah, we do. We can do that. That's fine. Waterfall is going to just work fine. And unless there is that switch or that understanding, or that understanding that, nope, this is not the kind of problem we are dealing with, and we would benefit from an empirical approach, it's going to be difficult.
It is interesting, Gregory. If anybody asked me those questions, of course I would say, no, I don't know what my customer is, you know, etc. But there's still a desire to learn, you know, to spend a little bit of time prepping, to spend a little bit more time prepping, to spend, well, let's spend that extra 2 weeks. You know, I mean, it's only 2 weeks. We can do a design sprint. We can do, and then you finish that and you're like, well, we haven't quite got that information. We haven't got, you know, and you carry on. It's not that I would explicitly say I know, and there's many people I speak to, they, of course we don't know what our customer wants, but we want to know a bit more before we actually ask them. You know, how do you break that cycle? How do you persuade them to, because I don't want to look like an idiot delivering something that the customer really doesn't want. I don't want to look like an idiot even having the conversation with the customer without me doing a lot of analysis. How do you balance that, Gregory?
Okay. I think, again, as I said, starting with the mindset, like, or the aligning on the type of problem that we are dealing with at the start is very important. If you get your sponsors, especially the execs or senior management, to say, yes, that's the kind of problem that we are not going to crack just in one attempt, then many things follow. And if you don't have that, like, why bother investing in a CI/CD pipeline? Why bother having the testers or the UX designers and the programmers work together in a cross-functional team? Or nothing's going to make sense to them, right? Other than that, I think there's a big misunderstanding around how we deal with risk in agile development and Scrum. Not everyone, but many people in Japan who have a shallow understanding of agile development look at it as something that is risky, unprofessional, maybe even. They would incorrectly assume that delivering early and often leads to lower quality, for instance, and they don't see that delivering early and often is a great recipe for risk control. I often use the analogy of the kaiten sushi restaurant in my Japanese classes. Do you know what it is, Dave?
No. Tell me what one of those is.
Okay, maybe I can take you to one in a few months.
Oh, excellent. That sounds great. Food and learning, that would be a great combination. That sounds awesome.
Let's do that. And so at the kaiten sushi restaurant, instead of ordering a whole set course, you choose one or two sushis, just one or two pieces, items, yeah? You eat, and then you reconsider. Am I full? Yes, no. Was it good? Yes, no. What else do they have? What else do I want to try, etc.? And you repeat until you're satisfied. And there is no wasted food by doing that. There is no wasted money on the part of the consumer, obviously. And if the consumer ordered something they didn't like, well, the impact is minimized because every plate is just one or two pieces, yeah?
Yeah.
And so the kaiten sushi restaurant analogy is a great example or analogy of how small batches help reduce waste, control risk, and increase customer satisfaction, let's say. And so because there is this big misunderstanding, I think that's one situation where clearly a teaching stance, teaching or guiding your client through a better understanding of the kind of problem they're dealing with and how agile development may help is powerful. Teaching is not the solution to everything, but I think there's a deficit of understanding around this area.
So if you were telling me that about this kind of restaurant, I would say, well, hang on a minute. That can't be very efficient, because that means the waiter or waitress has to come multiple times. And hang on a minute, doesn't that mean that we have to, you see that, and that is true of how people perceive this small batch size challenge. So what do you say when they say, well, we haven't got enough waiters for that?
They have a CI/CD pipeline.
So they use automation?
Yes, exactly, yes.
That's so smart.
The sushi plates on a trail and just the thing comes to the table automatically. So there you go. The analogy works even on that front.
Oh my gosh! So then, that is awesome. But the other thing that's interesting about how you frame this, and see if I get this right, and we'll discuss this for a second, hopefully, is that ultimately you ask some questions. Am I full? Did I enjoy it? Was, do I, do I need a drink now? I'm sort of adding questions, but you've got that classic sort of like incremental eating model. And that's true really of when we look at a problem, we've got this product goal, and we want to ask questions of it. And they are the best sprints that are focused on answering those questions. When a sprint goal relates to a series of questions that we need to uncover, then that's awesome. And I think that kind of those questions need to be brought front and center. So you say, well, no, yeah, we do know the customer and we're awesome, but there's a couple of things we don't quite know, maybe. Let's look at that for a minute. Is that really what you were sort of saying? Does that make sense, Gregory?
Yeah, that's exactly what's happening. You can order whatever you want, just a little bit, and reconsider later, which is, I think, what's happening when you're doing Scrum. You go after one sprint goal, you inspect, you adapt, and you see from there. So yeah, the analogy works quite well.
It does. The other thing that it does, particularly for leaders, is you don't have to spend, you can stop spending money. I know at a restaurant, I don't know about you, Gregory, but I live in America, so we big portions, right? And we're like, when you go into the restaurant, you're like, yeah, I want an appetizer, I want a main course. Let's think about, let's buy dessert, let's do it. And the appetizers are so big that I don't really need the main course. But because we've ordered it, and we're going to spend the money, I managed to eat it, and then I also ate the dessert, and then I come out of the restaurant feeling not the best. And that's true of this as well. That analogy, I'm going to be using this analogy from now on. I think it's awesome.
And I'm going to take you to a kaiten sushi restaurant very soon.
I'm going to hold you to that. So one of the things about the restaurant, as you were describing to me, Gregory, was it seemed it must be quite disciplined, right? You've got this automated way of food coming out. You probably got a kitchen that makes sure that all of the right different bits of sushi, which I, by the way, love. So that I'm very excited about the visit. The different pieces of sushi are being delivered, and also somebody watching. Maybe there's a big hit on Miyagi, or one of the, was a particular role that's become massively popular, so they're keeping an eye on it. It's a very disciplined, very structured, very data driven, very is that the case? I mean, Japan strikes me as a very disciplined place. So one of the strengths must be around discipline then in an agile situation. Is there anything that you've seen around discipline and the value of discipline?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, things that come to mind is, and I think people who come to Japan realize that after just a few days of being around, is things are just function really well, really effectively. Trains are on time. When flights resumed after when the pandemic settled down, I think it was chaotic in many airports around the world, I heard, but that did not happen to the same extent at all in Japan. I took a health check, my annual health check the other day, and there were dozens, if not hundreds, of people in the same batch as I was, and everything was so efficient and smooth, and my experience as a patient also wasn't bad at all. I mean, it's a health check, but so the efficiency also in the healthcare system is quite impressive. So yeah, discipline definitely. Somewhat related to that.
And that's crucial, right? To effectively managing these batch sizes smaller and doing things, you need to increase your discipline.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that this is not like exactly this is definitely not the only thing you need to have agility and effective autonomous cross-functional teams, but it does help. It does help because and maybe that relates to commitment as well, which is a Scrum value, right? That, as you know, in a Scrum team, you want to have the right degree of healthy pressure coming from within, pressure to commit to each other, pressure to be professional, pressure to be pressure to deliver, and you don't want that pressure to be coming from the outside, right? teams that are able to get that pressure from within, they are less likely to suffer from collective underperformance, let's say. And it is also less likely, I think, that several months later or years later, some new management comes in and they say, this team is broken, so let's go back to old ways of working. Now I'm in control. So yeah, in many teams that I've worked with over the last 6 years that I've been here, where Agile had a foot in the door, let's say, of the team, or a foot in the door of the organization. And again, the prerequisite would be sponsorship support agreement. Yeah. When that happens, those agile teams can really be effective, and agility can really shine in Japanese teams. That's my experience.
And to some extent, that is because of some of this underlying cultural elements of Japan, but the sort of the maniacal focus on the customer, for instance, the well organized, the discipline we just talked about. Is that the case?
Yeah. So if I compare it to France, and not because I want to do some French bashing, but just happens that the French people are the people I arguably understand best. In France, if you call some agency or government office, whatever that be, but you call the wrong number, and the wrong person ends up answering your phone call, and you start complaining or asking some question to the wrong person, they are not gonna treat you very nicely. Yeah. What? Who's that guy? Why is this guy calling me? They're gonna make you feel lame, like you're an idiot for calling the wrong number, or wasting their time. Yeah, that's not gonna happen to you in Japan, even if you call the wrong person, the wrong service. They're not gonna try to make you feel like an idiot. They're gonna try and help you the best of their capacity. So I think that comes from a mix of conscientiousness, respect for the customer, commitment, sense of responsibility, and so on. So yeah, fully agree.
It's interesting you bring that up. Before the pandemic, I was in Brazil, and one thing that I noticed at Sao Paulo was that the teams that Brazil has a very family, very sort of like teamy. I don't know if you've seen their soccer teams, but they're very passionate and very supportive of each other. And it was really clear that psychological safety and trust was something that was easier there than in other cultures where there's more competition. It's all about striving they liked to work as a team. And I think that it is interesting that Agile, when you lean into the cultural strengths of a society, and accept and be mindful of some of the challenges in that society. You talked about risk earlier, for instance. You can really do fantastic things bringing in Agile in those situations.
Brazil would be an interesting culture to compare Japan with. I don't know what kind of differences there are, but listening to your story, I feel like it's harder to get that psychological safety here in Japan, because a lot is not being said. And so I think people think more about what happens if I say this, or what are people thinking of me right now. We know that some things are not being said, so it makes people think twice. Yeah. So not that easy to implement a psychologically safe culture here in Japan, I think.
Yeah, that is interesting, and it is easier, and it's also in the Netherlands, which is the most agile place in the world. You get coffee in the Netherlands, and it's usually served by a Scrum Master. Because of culturally, the Netherlands has this directness, which can be a little off-putting at times, but is incredibly refreshing when you're doing an agile. So they have a different kind of culture that's created psychological safety there. And of course, these are all, we're talking generalizations, and everybody's slightly different, and the world is very complex and different. But in general, there is something there that's really interesting. So I guess as we come up to the end of this podcast, and it really, I think, being aware and being mindful of culture and the dynamics of that culture when you're working often with teams that are made up of people from many different cultures now. The reality is when you're building products in multinational organizations, you never know those cultures, but being mindful of that, I think, is super important. But just focusing back on Japan at the moment, we talked about the adoption of agility isn't perhaps as widespread as we would like. It's sort of in the earlier adopter type thing. We also, in the previous podcast, talked about how much innovation. Obviously, we're all very much aware of Nintendo and Toyota and all these sort of organizations. So that's interesting as well. We also talked about some of the cultural elements that make agile work really well, like maniacal focus on the customer, the discipline, etc. So what do you think's next for Japan? I mean, in terms of agile adoption, what would be your sort of parting words around people that listen to this podcast? Maybe they're working with teams that have Japanese people in them, from Japan, or maybe they're working in Japan, or maybe they're working with suppliers from Japan. What would be your parting words around this?
Okay, thank you for a great question. I think I encourage people not to be frustrated with their Japanese colleagues. That's something I hear from people who come from outside Japan, is that very rapidly they become frustrated. They are quick to judge how things are being done in Japan, and I think that's unhelpful, unhealthy, and they fail to appreciate that there's a lot to be learned also from how things are done in Japan. So yeah, that's my first message to anyone who's coming to Japan and trying to be helpful. The other thing is, I think we need more leaders. If you happen to be one of those early adopters, if you're doing something that is working and you think some others might benefit from it, think through what you can do for the rest of the community. Because you're an early adopter right now. So if you want to help Japan continue growing as a country, I think if there's a lot you can do by sharing the know-how that you've gained, by being an early adopter of agile development or Scrum or whatever. And so I encourage also people to do that, become leaders.
Great messages, Gregory. And actually not just unique to Japan. I think we need great leaders throughout the world. And I think there's also a propensity to always look for the negative whenever you go into any new situation or environment and compare it to maybe a view of the world that isn't necessarily also accurate of the world that you're comparing it to. And this can't work here, and these are idiots. And I think that ultimately, by being curious and being humble, I think a lot of great things can happen. And also carrying a level of enthusiasm. Let's not forget that, because if you do these things, amazing stuff happens. We know that. We've been on those projects, on those products, and we have seen the power of this way of working change the world, and or at least change the little bit of world that we're dealing with. So really exciting opportunities. Gregory, thank you for spending the time today. I understand it's late where you are, early where I am, and I really do always learn something, and I'm very excited to come to Japan in November and have a few go to one of these restaurants and have a few pieces of sushi, though unfortunately my metric system, my metrics that I use to determine whether I'm full aren't necessarily well tuned. So you're going to have to help slow me down a little bit in terms of my consumption. It's you know, they're lagging indicators would be a good way to describe them. But but I'm excited to see this continuous delivery process and pipeline in operation in a sushi restaurant. That's going to be great.
Thank you, Dave, for your great questions, for your curiosity and your enthusiasm. We need it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gregory. So thanks everybody for listening. This is Dave West, the host of the Scrum.org community podcast. Today I asked some questions of Gregory Fontaine, a PST based in Tokyo, Japan, and we really leaned into the culture and the differences of how culture influences agile adoption. Maybe some of these ideas resonated. This is part 2 of a podcast, so if you've not listened to part 1, take your time, download it maybe, or other podcasts in the series. There's a whole collection of some really interesting things worth listening to. So thanks for listening, and Scrum on, everybody.